Before we solve this problem, one thing that jumps out to me right off the bat is that this problem has no real numbers. And remember, whenever your problem has no numbers, no values, choosing numbers is going to be a great way to attack the problem. So to start, let's choose a couple test values for x. If x is anything between -1 and +1, and if x can't be 0, two great test candidates might be +1/2 and -1/2. The reason I'm choosing these values, look, first, 1/2 is easy to work with. Two, I want to make sure I think about what happens with positive numbers as well as with negative numbers. To get things started, therefore, I'm simply going to take these values and plug them into the answer choices to see which of the statements must be true. In the case of the first statement, we get 1/1/2 is greater than 1/2. Let's simplify this a bit. Remember, when you divide a number by a fraction, a very simple way to clean up the work is to multiply the numerator by the flip of the denominator. In other words, 1 divided by 1/2 is the same thing as 1 times 2/1, and that, of course, is the same thing as 2, leaving us with the statement 2 is greater than 1/2. That is a true statement. On the flip side, however, when we plug in -1/2, we get the statement 1/(-1/2 is greater than -1/2. And when we simplify that, 1 divided by -1/2 is the same thing as 1 times -2/1, which of course is -2. -2, however, is not a greater value than -1/2. Remember, when you're on the negative side of the number line, the further away from 0 you are, the smaller you become. -2, therefore, is not greater than -1/2. That's why the first statement does not have to be true. That's why it is not included among the correct answers. Now, in the case of the second statement, when we plug in +1/2, we get the statement 1/2 is greater than 1/2 squared. And remember, when we square 1/2, 1/2 times 1/2 is 1/4. That gives us the statement 1/2 is greater than 1/4. That's true. But when we plug a -1/2, what do we get? We get -1/2 is greater than -1/2 squared. Well, squaring -1/2, that's -1/2 times -1/2, which is +1/4, leaving us with the statement -1/2 is greater than +1/4. That's false. We know that all positive numbers are bigger than all negative numbers. That's why the second statement is also not included among the correct answers. It doesn't have to be true. Now, by default, that means the third statement has to be true because you have to have at least one correct answer in these sorts of questions, but let's go ahead and prove it. When we plug in 1/2, we get 1/2 squared is greater than 1/2 cubed. And when we simplify this, 1/2 times 1/2 is 1/4. And 1/2 times 1/2 times 1/2 is 1/8. And yes, 1/4 is a bigger value than 1/8. And likewise, when we plug in -1/2, we get -1/2 squared is greater than -1/2 cubed. And -1/2 squared, that's -1/2 times -1/2, which is +1/4. And -1/2 cubed, that's -1/2 times -1/2 times -1/2. That is -1/8. And again, a positive number is always bigger than a negative number. That means this statement must be true. And that's the proof that the third statement is our correct answer.